Thank you so much, Professor McCoy, for that introduction that works so nicely for my talk, because I don't have to tell all that story. It works really well. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, and I'd like to thank Professor Mary McCoy and Keng and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, or is it Southeast Asian Studies Center?
Good, either one.
And the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Let me start. I thought I'd start with the reading part, because authors should give you at least a taste when they are given such opportunities to give you a taste of the fiction. But I always envy people, I always envy poets, because poets, can finish something, for one. And they have the little segues of, I wrote this when I was, this age, and there's introductions, and it's just very performative. A fiction writer doesn't have as much of that, and it's always a regret for me. But thank God for flash fiction. So I'm going to read something that I can, one, finish, and two, I won't have to say, well, you need to know this about the narrator, and I'm reading this part when X, Y, and Z, which it kind of bogs everything down, doesn't it? So I am going to read one thing. It's basically a short story called Passport, and it's 500 words long. It also forms the title story of the French edition of my first collection. Blood happily was translated into French, and the anchor story and the title of that is, I would guess, Passport, but that's the title of the book, which was published in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. I'm not reading it in French, by the way. So, Passport. You know nothing. Sadness tastes fierce, like salt on your lips that never goes away. It's sore and dry and tight behind your eyelids because no tears are left. Heartache washes over everything good, because those you love cannot know such pleasures as the taste of cherries or the sight of snowflakes tumbling from the sky. I know that you would understand. For what have you suffered really? Nothing. You will fly home, perhaps later than you planned. Another one will be issued for a small fee. You will rebook your flight. Nothing. Just a small, fleeting inconvenience. And then you will take your children to see more sights, feed them ice cream and waffles and fried chicken, enjoy the city. You will ride bicycles by the lake and shop at the outlets. Maybe your things will no longer fit in the suitcases you brought. You'll buy another suitcase, or you'll ask me for a cardboard box to ship to your house in Manila. The $150 this service will cost? Nothing. It is so easy to pay. And then you will fly home and forget this like it never happened. So yes, I am grateful your family came to visit. I am glad you exclaimed during the dinner that I cooked for your family and the family I work for, that your passport needed to be renewed. It was news to me that you are American, just like your cousin, my employer. You can go anywhere in the world and still go home. Me, I have no choice. As I washed the dishes that same night, I prayed that somehow you might have the new passport sent to the house by mail. And then, like magic, like a miracle. It arrived 3 days later in a large brown envelope. My heart was full of trembling as I felt the hard booklet through the stiff paper. So I lied to you. I looked you in the eye and told you nothing had come. The mailbox was empty except for bills. I acted surprised and I sympathized with you as I played with your daughter. And in her eyes, I saw mine. Maybe they had not sent it yet, I said. Or maybe it got lost in the mail. But all that time it was in my room beneath my mattress. People will take it. They will change the name, change the photo, and then my daughter can come. Wasn't I able to come here in just the same way? Forgive me. I haven't seen her or my son in 10 years. There is an ocean of difference between you and me. We each live on separate planets that orbit the sun. But you are a mother. You do everything for your children. Me, I left them. I sent all my money back. We do what we need to do. I took it, and I do it again, as many times as I must, until my babies are here with me, the way yours are always with you. So that's Passport. It's just one of 25 short stories. There are longer stories, but it's just a good thing to read out loud because it's short. It's a short story. And I seem to be missing, here. So that short story appeared, interestingly, for the first time in a journal out of Australia. It was published by Leap magazine, and the magazine is basically a translation and literary regional publication. Anyway, I thought I'd start by telling you stories. A long time ago, a lifetime ago, I sat in my fiction writer's workshop and listened as a Caucasian man writer and a black woman argued about the former's short story. His main character, his protagonist, was an African-American mother. And the two black female writers in our class had taken violent, strong issue. Not so much with the story, although they seem to have problems with that as well, but with the idea that he even dared to have a black female protagonist in the first place. It was cultural appropriation, they said. I forget what the story was about, or even whether I liked it, but I remember fidgeting and feeling deeply uncomfortable because whatever my alliances were at that time, socially, politically, who my friends were even, in that moment I was on the side of the white male Caucasian writer. Because I believe as a storyteller, I believe that a storyteller is free to take whatever point of view they choose or believe best fits the particular story they're telling. Why are we storytellers at all if such limits are imposed on our imagination? And how can we envision to our fullest extent if there are places we are forbidden to go, even in our minds? I feel, and I still feel, nothing should be beyond our point of view. And the world is of such variety and diversity after all. Why shouldn't we be free to gaze and empathize from any place and any person, and in so doing create real, credible characters and learn and imagine the truth of their own stories? Is it difficult to do? Yes. Is it problematic? Yes. because it will always be subject to scrutiny and criticism of others. Is it possible that a writer can get it wrong? Yes. But they have to have the choice to try. Is it worth doing? I say yes. Because by taking the unexpected other point of view, whomever that other may be, will ultimately bring you closer in understanding of that character and their circumstance. And more than that, will lead you to stories that might not have been seen or told, or that you or I might not have seen to be told otherwise. Should you choose or be drawn as a storyteller to create and inhabit a character who is alien to you in race, culture, background, sexual preference, sexuality, whatever it may be, you are going to have to do the hard work and do it as well as you can by all the means available to you. So when my students ask me, can I take that point of view? My answer is always, well, I don't know. Can you? In order to understand other people who are not like me, I need imagination and empathy. And this kind of imagining is something I've done my entire life. To try and figure out why a person different from me does what they do or behaves in that particular way. That's why I write. That's why I like to tell stories, especially of various characters who are thrown together against specific cultural and historical circumstances. I'm fascinated by the discord and the conflict that takes place between and among different kinds of people. So I have written from the point of view of a white Caucasian man, of a priest, of a Filipino prostitute, of a, you name it. I like to go there and inhabit those kinds of characters. And have I done it well? Well, here's the problem. You have to read to find out. And that brings another kind of talk about publishing and how things get published that I'm not going to talk about, but that's basically that. And throughout my life, as Professor McCoy said, I have lived in 3 countries and 2 continents. Manila in the Philippines, where I'm originally from, where my parents are from, and where I grew up and come of age. Singapore, the small, multiracial, multicultural country where I have lived as a trading spouse, but also as a professional writer for 24 years, coming to 25, and to a lesser but nonetheless significant extent, the United States, where I was born, where I did graduate school, and where I've lived for odd periods at various times and in various circumstances. So I have always had to contend with questions about my identity. But more important, as a fiction writer, I've always had to contend with expectations about the things I write. For example, I'm always seen as writing, are you going to write about Filipino stories, about Filipinos in the Philippines, even though I've never ever told stories that way. Now, I write about Filipinos in the world. But I also write about Singaporeans, Americans, Australians, British. I've started saying that I write about all kinds of people in a world that has all kinds of people in it. Then they say, are you Filipino? Are you American? Are you Singaporean now? I was once married to a Filipino. Now I'm married to a Singaporean. But it's the same guy. It's come to a point where I feel it's most honest to claim all the identities, because I identify them all and conduct myself accordingly. It's become easier to think of myself as a global person and therefore a global writer, writing whatever the lit crit people are calling it now. World literature, global stories, cross-border literature. I don't know what they're calling it now, but it's always better for me not to know that part, and it's better for my work. Apart from publishing in small magazines, I came basically to my 2 books quite late. I was 48 when Blood Collected Stories came out of Singapore's Ethos Books, Singapore's Ethos Books in 2015. Professor McCoy already said that Cursed and Other Stories was the first new book that the then new Penguin Random House Southeast Asia line put out. And it came out in the last part of 2019, and for this reason I consider it cursed. Because it was right before pandemic. It's very difficult to come out with a book right before pandemic, and it's very difficult to sell a book during pandemic. So that, my book Cursed and Other Stories is also, I feel, cursed. But I have copies here in case anyone wants them. And then during the last 3 years of the pandemic, I was forced to set aside the novel that I had started in 2018, and I did an English translation of a novel in Tagalog by the renowned film scriptwriter Ricky Lee, who was named National Artist for Media in 2022. And it took 3 years, and the title of that novel is For B, or How Love Devastates 4 out of Every 5 of Us. And it was published in 2023. I also edited a collection of very short stories called Missed Connections, Microfiction from Asia, which came out again in 2023. And for all the other reasons associated with the pandemic and commercial content writing for fee, my current novel that I'm working on is still in progress. But as Professor McCoy mentioned, when I was at Iowa last semester, I encountered the 33 other writers from around the world. And my story of multiple affiliations is not anything, multiple country affiliations is not anything in common, not anything unique actually, because almost everybody, there were many writers there with calling 1 or 2 places home. Kevin Chen is a Taiwanese writer who lives in Berlin, and his novel, Ghost Town, the English translation is Ghost Town, has been translated into 17 languages. And it's about a man accused of murdering his German boyfriend, a Taiwanese man. That Ghost Town. There was a Mexican novelist, Brenda Navarro, whose 2 novels, these are the English translations, Empty Houses and Eating Ash. She now lives in Madrid. There was a poet from Hong Kong, based in Paris, a writer from Yemen, now a Dutch citizen, another Taiwanese novelist who taught herself Japanese and now writes novels in Japanese, Lee Kotomi. My story of multiple homes and affiliations is not unique, and nor is the fact that I write in English, as the writers from Africa, the West Indies, and Fiji also do. But what they write is world literature intrinsically, and precisely the way Goethe, who first coined the phrase, meant it. What I wanted to talk about today is how the 2 Southeast Asian countries that I call home create this constant mental compare and contrast that happens, that's proven fruitful grist for my fiction mill. The 2 countries could not be more different from each other, to the point that I've had discussion after discussion about why is the Philippines where it is, and why is Singapore where it is, and why does that happen? And some of the reasons are self-evident: size, the kind of population, the kind of government, Singapore's position of starting from scratch, and the Philippines' long history of landed, colonial, and landless. But I'm not an academic or a historian, and I'm not a literary critic, so I'm I'm just going to tell you stories that should demonstrate the differences between the two countries. Story number 1, Manila. 1990, my first job. Tax time. We are in a brownout because they were happening daily at the time. And the entire creative department had to queue to one desk where a secretary would look up their tax account number and scribble it on a piece of scratch paper, hand it to each person. That person would then go to another line, queue up, and then fill out, when they got to the head of the line, get their tax form and fill in the tax number. In that way, we would have achieved tax payment. And there was someone, it was my first job, and I was a newbie, the first time I was doing this, and someone in front of me, I happened to be watching without even knowing I was watching them. And he took the scratch paper with his tax number, turned and shot it, basketball-like, into a waste paper basket. Then he moved to the other line and scribbled I don't know what on his tax form. Why he did that? Was it because of the brownouts that were happening daily? We were sweating in 3 hours. Did he do that? Does he do that all the time? I did not know, but it stayed with me forever. That's story number 1, Manila 1990. Story number 2, Singapore 2004. I was deputy editor of a magazine, a local women's magazine, and we were trying to increase readership by covering more sexy stories. The reporter that we were working with had written one on swinging couples in Singapore. She had written one on fetishes. And the last one that she had worked on was something about formal orgies taking place in the city-state that people could attend. I was deputy editor and I said, okay, this is the direction, and the editor-in-chief said, this is the direction. We had to compete with the one other #1 magazine that belonged to the one other media company in Singapore at the time. There were only 2. And it was fine. We published the story. 2 weeks later, I am summoned, along with my editor-in-chief and the reporter, to meet with executives from the Media Development Authority. And my 2 colleagues were terrified. And I was a little bit terrified, but not that terrified. And we walked into the offices, and 3 elderly men, and I actually, now that I'm closer to that age, I'm not saying they weren't that elderly. Maybe they were in their late 50s, mid-50s. I should stop saying elderly. And they interrogated us about why we chose to report these kinds of stories. And I remember that I was very vocal, pointing to the fact that these stories weren't salaciously nor provocatively written. They weren't designed they were just straight up reportage. And much worse existed outside for anyone to read on the internet. And one of the gentlemen said, what happens elsewhere will not do here. We are not ready. It was clear to me as the foreigner and the once upon a time editor of Cosmo Philippines that to them, this was my fault. To them, it was my undue influence, and I flashed for a minute. I had a flash of worry about my own status and my own working papers. Our punishment was that we were threatened basically with the revoking of our press license. We had to submit our lineups and our layouts 3 weeks in advance of print. And every single time a piece referred to sexual intercourse, we had to edit it by saying sexual intercourse between a husband and a wife. Or sexual intercourse between an engaged couple. So we did that for 6 months, and then they gave us back our license. Story number 3, Manila, 2016. I was in Manila to do a reading for another collection, and I was in a taxi. It was August 2016, and there was a new president. And I was very curious about the 16 million that had voted for this new president. And I struck up a conversation with the Uber driver about who he voted for, what he thought of the situation. Asked in any Southeast Asian city, the drivers, the taxi drivers and the Uber drivers are a great source of information, but most especially for a fiction writer. I had a conversation with him, and indeed, the man had voted for the new president. And indeed, he was aware that well before the new president's inauguration, there were reports of corpses turning up, wrapped up in mummy fashion, taped with the signs, "Do not imitate," that was happening throughout the city and outside of the greater Manila area. And the driver said, well, that's what the country needs. Someone who will take out the trash. But I said, but not all of these people are drug users, and even then, and the driver shrugged. I said, quite a number have nothing to do with the drug trade, there are innocent people, and he said, that's just the way it is. By the way, I need to plug a book by my friend, a fellow Theresian, where I went to high school. Patricia Evangelista has a wonderful book called Some People Need Killing that reads like a novel, but it's not. So if you're interested, do read about that. Anyway, the driver agreed, yes, it's true, many who are shot have nothing to do with it, but what are you gonna do? At least the president is a regular Joe, just like me. I was quiet for the rest of the ride, and when we were nearing the reading, I noticed that the car that we were driving was new, and I asked him how long he'd been driving, and he said, oh, just a little under a year. And I said, oh, what did you do before that? I was this and that, he said. Small business, buy and sell. And I said, what kind of small business? And he looked into the rear view mirror and made eye contact and said, hold upper, hold upper, mugger. And I was like, okay. And then he asked me, where does your family live in Manila? And I said, QC, Quezon City, which is big enough. And I got out of the car. Story number 4, Singapore, 2020. I don't know if you know, but when we had SARS, Singapore wrote the book on contact tracing. And that just got up further with smartphone technology. And so they had 2 apps that everybody had to download, Trace Together, TT, and Safe Entry, SE. And I think that the World Health Organization actually has commended these apps and suggested them to other countries in case, God forbid, something else like that happens again. And we had to all download these apps, and every masked resident had to sign in with a QR code to every commercial establishment. Even our exercise areas had the QR codes that you had to let people know that I was here and then I left. And our daughter, like many of the Singapore's residents and students who were told to return to Singapore, in the pandemic, she came home, but she had to be quarantined from the household for 2 weeks. And people who had the space to do that had to prove it. They had to have to show that they had a room and, sufficient space that they would be apart. And she had to then log in to the GPS system. And every now and then, during that 2-week period that she was in our house, but we couldn't touch, we had to be at a distance, they would call her and ask her to show her surroundings, so she couldn't step out, even for exercise, show everything on the phone. And that gave new meaning to Big Brother's watching. But not everything was well in hand in Singapore during the pandemic because of the huge outbreaks that happened in the migrant worker population due to lack of social distancing in the worker dormitories. Story number 5, Manila 220. The COVID response in the Philippines under Duterte was not only poor, it was cruel, most especially to the urban poor. Not only did government measures, or more accurately, the lack of them, not prevent the deaths in disease, it caused extreme hardship. There was no public transport, so GP drivers lost their means of livelihood. Health workers for a time could not even get to the hospitals until shuttle buses were organized by the Vice President, who ironically had no budget for that initiative. The pandemic also revealed how far behind the country is in terms of education and health sectors, because we are finding out now how much the students have suffered and are behind their counterparts in Southeast Asia. And while many of us, I'm sure, suffered personal loss, my family was not exempt either. My youngest sister discovered she had a rare, symptomless bone cancer right before pandemic, and she had to do her very intense chemotherapy during that time. And even when she managed it, 9 months later, in 2021, she developed acute myeloid leukemia as a secondary cancer, which was likely brought about by the chemotherapy. I'm telling this story because it reveals just how far behind the Philippine private healthcare system is. What leukemia needs in its treatment are blood transfusions, and the hospital blood banks were empty, even the private hospital blood banks. So we had to organize our own blood drives, only to find we couldn't even we wouldn't have full use of the blood processing equipment. So the long story short is, instead of what she should have received, which would have been 5 to 6 transfusions a day to manage any internal bleeding, she got 2. So we lost her in November of 2021 to a severe brain bleed. And that same year, earlier, all that time I was trying to get her to come to Singapore. There were too many restrictions on travel, a 14-day quarantine. But that same year, the Vice President went to Singapore for her own personal treatment. And of course, she didn't have to go through the 14-day quarantine. Even when things started to open up, we started to hear from Filipino nurses how this government official or that government official were seeking medical treatment in Singapore. That's the reality. My last story is about Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift came to Singapore early this year, and tickets went on sale a year before, and everybody had to scramble with their thumbs to get the tickets, and not everybody got it. And all the countries in Southeast Asia had to find either tickets to Singapore tickets to Japan or even to Australia. And we found out a few weeks or was it a month before that the reason why Taylor Swift chose to stay in Singapore was because of a government grant that said, just do all the shows here, they'll come. And they did. And the grant was from the Singapore Tourism Board and the Ministry of Culture, so her team could dispense with the burdensome logistics of mounting a high-tech 3-hour show that would have been impossible in other Southeast Asian countries, read the Philippines. With that grant, she could stay and keep it simple, and Singapore made about 370 million in tourism cash. I had a friend who got a ticket, but failed to book her airline ticket, and found that she could not afford, at the time, the price of the airline ticket, and therefore had to give up her ticket to Taylor Swift. For fiction writers like me, these stories are what connects, how we connect basically the global human community. And even while we write the local, we address the global. And of course, the British and American hegemony plays its part. I want to be published by a US publisher. My friends want to be published by a US or UK publisher, but it's more than that. Adam Kirsch, the author of the global novel, observes writers from outside see individual fates from an international perspective. The personal is political, is true across the globe. And the forces and issues that bear upon our main characters are nothing else but global. As Hirsch says, the cardinal sins of our time have converged, and global literature, especially the novel, is not the homogenizing and coercive force it's been called, but the herald and agent of a dawning collective conscience. A dawning collective conscience. Sounds great. That's the kind of thing I want to be part of through my fiction. That's it. That's all I have.